So you're trying to learn a new language, right? But you're still asking yourself the question, where do I start? I've studied about a dozen languages or so, and when I tell people that, the first thing they always ask me is, well, why? But after that they ask me, how do I do it? And generally I can't answer with a 10-minute explanation of how I learn each of these languages. So today I decided I would compile what I believe is the most efficient and best way to learn a language, based off of my personal experience and what's worked best for me. So without further ado, let's learn about language. Now, when you start learning a new language, really the only way you can actually begin is by understanding the basics. So what I mean by that is pretty much getting a grasp of the basic grammar and some of the basic vocabulary, and phonology as well, how the language sounds. Ways I definitely like to do that is by buying a book in the language. I really like the colloquial series, which is right there behind me. Or if it's a smaller and less spoken language, I usually can find other publishers, or I find PDFs online. Let's take Haitian Creole for example. I've been studying it for 2 weeks now, and I recently just progressed from this beginning phase. So right here I have my book in my journal, and what I've done is pretty much went through and understood the basic grammar of the language and some of the basic sounds. Getting the accent down is very key in this step. And from there, I just progress to the next step. So after you get the basics down, once everything is clear for you, you can go ahead and go towards step 2, which is learning the most common vocabulary. I always find that watching videos, especially those of music and those that have basic dialogue in the language, always help with finding what vocabulary you need to learn. And this point is actually where schools start to fail, because rather than teaching essential vocabulary, they go towards a more detailed and less useful vocabulary in the beginning. And what I mean by that is, instead of learning phrases that are very common like I think that, or seriously, or for example, they teach words like pants and cabinet and fireman. These words will most likely never come up in a beginning conversation, and if they do, great, you can learn them. But initially, it's best to focus on these more important words. And these basic words are what allow you to begin to finally understand and speak the language in a sense. And you can use these vocabulary words to build sentences or warp them into the ideas that you're trying to convey. A great example of this is when I was learning Persian. Instead of learning the more complex words at first, I focused on basic concepts like water, life, city, these sorts of words, and that allowed me to seem as if I spoke more Persian than if I were to have studied words like passion and worthy. And eventually, yeah, I do learn these words, but initially when you're trying to have a basic conversation, it's more practical to understand basic vocabulary and work from there. So this next step is probably the most important and probably also the roughest in the beginning, and you'll see what I mean. This step is to start speaking the language. Now, when we think about language, we don't really go towards the writing system or understanding ancient poetry, but rather we're more concerned with speaking with native speakers and having these conversations about life topics. So when I begin the speaking process, I usually use online platforms, especially italki for me, to find native speakers that can help me understand and become more comprehensible in the language and be able to form sentences, which is the most important part of this whole step. And when I encounter a word that I don't know, I usually write it in one of my journals and I refer back to it later and I add it to my vocabulary set that I made when learning the most common vocabulary. For that you can use things like Quizlet. It doesn't really matter what, it just matters that you study the vocabulary and the process just continues. You speak and then you study the words and you can use those words in the next lesson. So what I found is by doing a couple lessons every week, it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to begin speaking the language without having to write every other word on your page, and you can actually have this free-flowing conversation that's not very interrupted. And like I said, it's very rough in the beginning because you're not really able to form these sentences and construct these thoughts, but eventually that does fade away and you're able to come out speaking confidently in that language. One of my greatest success stories with this would be Polish. So about 2 months ago I started learning Polish and I was able to speak it at least 3 to 4 times a week using these 30-minute lessons on italki. And what I found is that by doing these and by reviewing the vocabulary, I was able to speak Polish after 2 weeks, and it was very confidently. I had conversations with people in my school, and it really works effectively. Now, once you've had a basic grasp on the language, then comes in immersion. Immersion is one of the key aspects of language learning because it's almost necessary for your mind to comprehend this new language. When I travel to my target destination, where the language is spoken, I'm able to interact with native speakers, and I'm also forced to be put on the spot to convey what I'm trying to say and to use this new language to express my ideas, thoughts, emotions, etc. So what I found is that this immersion process allows your brain to see the language as something familiar rather than something that's just another foreign language. The greatest thing about traveling for people is that it often doesn't cost as much and it can be quite cheap actually. Instead of paying for attractions and visiting these landmarks, which are great and you can still see a few of them, I prefer to go to villages and have conversations and understand more about where I'm going, because that's really the point of travel, isn't it? So a recent example of this phenomenon is when I went to Caucasia to film one of my documentaries about dying languages. So in these villages, I was able to ask these families, these very kind and very caring families I might add, about their dying languages in my target language, which was Russian at the time. So what I was able to do by forcing myself to go on this immersive trip, not only was I able to learn the language while I was there, but I was also able to give myself this accountability before the trip to learn as much of this language as I could. And that's very important because you can't really learn a language without being motivated and dedicated to it. Through this enjoyable and immersive trip to Caucasia, I was able to learn Russian in a matter of 2 months, just because I was enticed by the trip I was about to go on, and because I was able to practice it while I was there. Now, after you've went on this trip and you studied this language and you've found a deep love for it, you can now go towards the path to fluency. Now, the path to fluency is like a deep sea dive. You're having to go to these very deep depths. And that's the great thing about language. It's like this deep sea dive where you keep going deeper and deeper and it seems endless, but eventually you reach the bottom and that is fluency. Now, fluency isn't necessarily being C2 in a language where you're able to understand everything. You can read ancient poetry from medieval times, but you're just able to communicate everything you need to without having to struggle to find a word or not understand certain aspects of grammar. This path to fluency can take a few years or even decades depending on how invested you are in this language. But what I've found is that it's not always necessary. It's really based off of what you're trying to get out of the language. So now that you understand a little bit more on how to learn a language, Make sure to leave in the comments below which language you're trying to start this journey with. And like I said, it doesn't really take a lot of commitment, it just takes a lot of interest and passion. And that's exactly it. Language is just a game of passion and joy. It's not this complex mythical science that you're trying to decipher. It's just a way to learn more about this planet and to understand these different ideologies and cultures that our planet is made of. Thanks for watching this series. Make sure to subscribe to the Planet Project, and see you next time. Bye.